Thank you, Madam Chair. So first let me say I enjoyed Senator Manchin's comments, but there's some things that are a little misleading, and not that you intended to.
Not at all.
But I think it needs to be clarified.
I appreciate that. I thought it was very factual, but I appreciate the
clarification. It was, absolutely. But Louisiana and the 4 Gulf Coast states do not get 37.5% of everything produced out there. There's a cap of $500 million.
And you don't hit the cap yet.
And it is also production after a certain date certain, after a certain point in time. So it's not the entirety of it. And I'll show a graph. And also, we're always a little puzzled that federal waters are federal land, but federal land within a state boundary is not federal land for the purposes of how we do this.
I understand.
That always seems a distinction without a difference.
Within the boundaries.
Yes. So that said, to continue with my formal remarks, thank you, Madam Chair, for calling this hearing. Protecting revenues that go to Louisiana and other Gulf Coast states, increasing the share we receive for coastal restoration, hurricane and flood protection is one of my top priorities on this committee. In our state, by our state constitution, we use that money to rebuild our coastline. A coastline which is eroded in large measure because the Mississippi River for the benefit of inland ports. And when you have a levying of a river which distributes sediment and therefore helps to build and rebuild for the benefit of the tributaries of the Mississippi River, there seems to be some equity involved in terms of helping our state rebuild. It also is common sense, because if we get whacked by a hurricane, the federal government ends up spending a lot of money to rebuild that which was whacked. So I've introduced legislation with others on this committee. The Conservation of America's Shoreline, Terrain, and Aquatic Life, or the Coastal Act, which is part of today's hearing, to create a more equal revenue sharing treatment for states producing offshore energy revenue, kind of equivalent, if you will, to those that produce onshore. Now, for context, the Gulf accounts for approximately 16% of the nation's crude oil supply and 3% of the nation's natural gas. Recently, the EIA reported energy production in the Gulf set a record of 1.8 million barrels per day, with forecasts that production will continue increasing as other offshore facilities come online and technology evolution allows existing sites to become more efficient and productive. In 2018, Interior dispersed almost $9 billion to the federal treasury, state and local governments, tribes, and the Bureau of Reclamation from onshore and offshore energy production, and funds such as the Land Water Conservation Fund and Historic Preservation Fund also received funding. But let's just kind of break this down, if you can open this up. Stand up, please. So here we see, come a little bit forward, please. Above here is the federal offshore, below is the federal onshore. And we can see that offshore, that the U.S. Treasury has received about $3.1 billion over this time frame. This is Go Mesa there, quite a small fraction of the total amount of money dispersed. Here is the Land Water Conservation Fund is authorized, and the Historic Preservation is authorized, and other offshore disbursements. But here's the onshore. The Treasury gets $0.41 billion. But state and local governments get almost $1.6 billion, with reclamation funds getting $1.2, and then other onshore disbursements. It should also be noted that in the Land Water Conservation Fund, a significant amount of this goes to states with onshore federal lands, so they're not only receiving roughly 50% share of the revenue from onshore, but they're also receiving dollars from the Land Water Conservation Act. And so, if you will, this is, you're getting it here, and you're getting it there, and sometimes there is righteous indignation when you say that's not fair. I would argue that if we're going to have this, we should have this as roughly equivalent. I'm not saying take from here, but I am saying allow the coastal states to use their dollars to rebuild the coastline, which in large measure has been lost in pursuit of policies which benefit inland states. I will also say in yesterday's testimony, it mentioned in New Mexico that these funds can be used for school programs and roads and other capital expenses. In our state, it's substantially dedicated to coastal restoration. Again, more limitations. So just to repeat, states and local governments receive roughly 50% of the federal revenues derived from onshore oil and gas and the federal land in that state. And then Gulf Coast states share 37.5% from offshore energy production. The Coastal Act seeks to address obvious inequity, removing an existing cap on the amount of dollars shared among the 4 Gulf states and the Land Water Conservation Fund, raising the percent of offshore revenue that can be shared by the Gulf states in eligible areas from 37.5 to 50%. It protects offshore dollars from sequestration and makes leases entered into between 2000 and 2006 eligible for revenue sharing in the future. Currently, again, only revenues after 2006 are considered eligible. It creates a separate revenue sharing for the state with the largest amount of coastline, which is Alaska. My state is dealing with a land loss crisis, threatening ecosystems and communities, economies and way of life. Again, as I mentioned, in Louisiana's Constitution, the funds we receive from revenue sharing go to protecting and rebuilding our coastline. I believe Chairman Klein will speak specifically to this, but my Gulf colleagues and I are looking for is equity and the ability to strengthen environmental protection efforts. The states are producing the revenues. The states know how to allocate the dollars in ways that will benefit our states and also our nation. Thank you for holding the hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses.
Mr. Klein, I'll be speaking with you. First, again, obviously we are in the Senate, and we always want to stick up for our home state, and so everybody says that your state's problems are unique and of national significance. But in this case, I think I'm being more than a homer. I think I'm actually got something to say to that. And you can give chapter and verse, but as I understand, we've lost land in Louisiana relative to relative sea level rise greater than the entire state of Delaware. I think I also know the Central Gulf has the greatest amount of elevation loss relative sea level rise in the entire nation. So Grand Isle has lost, for example, a barrier island off our coast, has lost, I think, is it 9 feet or 6 feet of elevation?
Approximately 8 feet, somewhere in between there, yes, sir.
Yes, 8 feet. Whereas the Florida coastline in Pensacola has been in the order of inches. Now, this is in part, large measure, because of the leveeing of the Mississippi River after the 1927 flood. Yes. And what's John's last name? The guy that wrote Rising Tide.
John Barry.
John Barry. I hate to say that this week with us playing Alabama, but you know about how that was done for the benefit of inland ports. Now, all that said, let me also compliment you because when Sheldon Whitehouse, our colleague from Rhode Island, came down, he said that our coastal master plan was the best developed of any state in the nation. So I know that's been going under 3 administrations at least, but just congratulations to the state. Now, all that to say, let's establish that this is not just of local or regional significance, but also of national. Can you tell us what national energy assets would be affected should we continue to have unabated coastal loss?
First of all, Senator, go Tigers. Big game this weekend. Senator, whenever we talk about the national economic assets that are housed in coastal Louisiana, I always like to start with Port Fourchon. Port Fourchon is on the front lines of coastal erosion and land loss in our state. It is a port that services 90% of the oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico. You also have the Louisiana Offshore Oil Port, which transports 70% of the oil produced in the Gulf of Mexico. You have 2 sites in coastal Louisiana which serve as our strategic housing for our strategic petroleum reserves, which house hundreds of millions of barrels of oil for emergency situations in our coast, across our country. Our LNG facilities rank 4th in the entire globe. We have major refineries across coastal Louisiana that refine the material that is produced off of our coast.
And by the way, if you include the coastal area and the Mississippi River, I would guess that in the United States there's no higher concentration of those making the refined plastics and petroleum products that we need to create jobs and power a modern economy.
That is exactly right, Senator.
Yes. And that is leaving off, if you will, I think after Alaska, we have the greatest amount of seafood production in the United States as well.
And then let me ask you this, because you'll know this. What is the general flood elevation in the region of our state where these energy assets and seafood industries are located?
So flood elevations vary across our coast, Senator, but typically the flood elevation across coastal Louisiana is just above 5 feet above sea level. Now, there are areas across our coast, where, for example, the city of New Orleans, that is probably close to 5 feet below sea level. And so the risk as a result of those elevations is that our coastal communities, if we experience a hurricane similar to the one of Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Rita, our coastal communities could see a storm surge of anywhere from 1 to 15 feet.
Now, if you rebuild coastline and you have those wetlands, if you will, as a bumper against that Cat 4 hurricane coming on shore.
Yes, sir.
How does that help diminish the impact of that hurricane?
So coastal restoration and hurricane protection go hand in hand. When you restore the natural environment, your natural buffer, your natural wetlands and your marshlands and your ecosystems, you are taking the pressure off of your inland hurricane protection systems. So when we're restoring our environment, that is really our first line of defense in coastal Louisiana.
I remember some statistic, for every mile of coastline, you take a Cat 4 down to a Cat 3.
Well, for every acre of wetland that you create or build, you knock down a storm surge by a certain percentage.
Now, let me ask as well, folks may be not aware, but I'm aware, the 3 of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage are in South Louisiana. So for the farmer in Iowa to get his goods to the rest of the world, then at a competitive price, it is the Port of New Orleans, the Port of South Louisiana, et cetera, that allows that to happen.
Yes, sir. 5 of the top 15 ports are housed in coastal Louisiana.
5 of the top 15. Now, I may have to ask Senator Landrieu to whisper into your ear, but I think we spent about $20 billion on Katrina, right?
I would say well north of $20 billion. And the government response to Hurricane Katrina was well over, I think, $100 billion in total response. Now, the hurricane protection system that was built around the greater New Orleans area was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $14 billion that was invested in that area responding to that disaster.
So I'm out of time, but let's just say that if we spend $100 billion in response, but instead we can have enhanced restoration, which in turn will decrease the potential need for another $100 billion, so that goods from Iowa can get around the world and that oil and gas can get from wherever to wherever. That would be a wise, penny-wise investment. Thank you, Mr. Klein. I yield back.